Welcome. Welcome on this beautiful evening. Wasn't it great to be able to come into a building without a big overcoat on and really enjoy the walk? Yeah, let's applaud the weather. I think Ralph Hauenstein had something to do with that. Ralph came back from Florida, and he's at our event tonight, and I think he brought some nice weather with him. At least we'll give him the credit for it. Thank you, Ralph. Well, I'd like to start off with a simple question. It's going to be a Tolstoyan question. Why are we here? Okay? I'm glad you bring a little sense of humor to that question, that profound question. Well, it all starts with a grand Rapidian named Ralph Hauenstein. That's why we're here tonight. Ralph will be 103 years old next week, next Friday. So I think he deserves another round of applause. And last Friday, a reporter heard that he was back in town and asked to come over and interview Ralph. And that interview will be in this Sunday's Grand Rapids Press and in M Live. So look for that interview, because in it, Ralph talks about his war experiences, some of his entrepreneurial experiences, his leadership experiences, his family, his ability to make things happen in this town because of his philanthropy and his generosity of heart. And Ralph, we love you for it. Thank you. Well, it goes without saying, Ralph inspires what we do around here. And consistent with Ralph's remarkable legacy of leadership and service, the mission of the Hauenstein Center is to do three basic things. First, it's to enrich our students' education in the liberal arts. Second, it's to build up Grand Valley's national profile and reputation. And third, it's to encourage civic engagement and informed discourse that makes common ground more possible in our communities. Let me explore what this means just for a minute. That's a tough thing to achieve nowadays. Everybody in this auditorium knows how tough it's been to achieve common ground in Washington and Lansing and in our own communities. But in our dysfunctional and cynical age, the Hauenstein Center seeks to rebuild confidence in our public institutions. We're not a left-wing enclave. We're not a right-wing enclave. The headlines and storylines of American history don't happen at the extremes in American politics or culture. The real action in American history, in American culture, takes place in the middle, and that's why the middle is anything but boring. There's no such thing. As a student of history, I can tell you, there is no such thing as the boring middle. That myth you hear on TV is just that, a myth. The middle is where we clash over our ideas and our principles. It's where people who are principled can come together and engage in the key questions of their day and find ways to compromise in a principled way. Not compromise for its own sake, but principled compromise. And it's the only way our democratic institutions can work. So we're not about turning Republicans into Democrats or Democrats into Republicans. We got plenty of people who are trying to do that. I think it would be educational malpractice for us to encourage groupthink. We are aiming higher. Our goal is to cultivate intellectual diversity and develop strong individuals who know their own minds, yet who have the ability to meet in the marketplace of ideas and create something of lasting value for our communities. It's what our founders did, it's what the civil rights movement achieved, and it's what the young people in this auditorium, your generation, is called to do. Now, our democratic institutions are made to absorb conflict. And they absorb conflict well if people who are in those institutions know how to work those institutions, who have the skills to do so. And that's where the Hauenstein Center comes in. With our Leadership Academy and our Common Ground Initiative, we see ourselves as outfitting a new generation of leaders to enter the public square and be able to achieve really smart and great things for our country. So that's what I wanted to tell you about why we're here tonight. That's what the Hauenstein Center stands for. Ralph and I have had many, many conversations about our purpose, and we're sticking with it. Well, at this point, I very much like to bring Joe Hogan up to the podium. Joe is our program manager for the Common Ground Initiative and a wonderful colleague to have on board, and he will introduce tonight's extraordinary speaker. Joe.
Thank you, Gleaves. It isn't often, perhaps it's too rare, for scholars in the humanities to commit their work to the public and to articulate compellingly why literature and the arts aren't just for humanities majors or college professors. The task is admittedly difficult. It's popular to ask, what good is it for people who live in the real world, in today's tough economy and job market, to read literature or study philosophy? And for those of us who suspect or who have discovered that the humanities can actually help us live better lives, can actually make us more humane, more empathic, the challenge is difficult. How do we present our case? This evening, we at the Hauenstein Center are pleased to host not only a great scholar, but a great apologist for the transformative power of literature, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman is an internationally recognized scholar of Russian literature at the University of Virginia and is the author of Understanding Tolstoy. He's best known for bringing Tolstoy to life for his students and readers, and for making Russian literature relevant to anyone who wants to ask big questions about life. He's taken his case to Oprah.com, to Katie Couric's talk show, which you can find on YouTube, and, in fact, to juvenile correctional facilities through his program, Books Behind Bars at Virginia. Dr. Kaufman's recent book, titled Give War and Peace a Chance, Tolstoyan Wisdom for Troubled Times, has received a great deal of acclaim, and for good reason. In it, Dr. Kaufman brings a sense of vitality, moral immediacy, and relevance to one of the toughest texts in history. Indeed, Dana Gioia, renowned poet and former head of the National Endowment for the Arts, writes that War and Peace is the very Everest of fiction, and that Dr. Kaufman is our much-needed Sherpa. Finally, I think it's worth noting that this leading voice in Russian literary studies does not hail from Moscow, but from Muskegon. Dr. Kaufman is in fact a West Michigander and began studying Russian at Grand Valley. So please join me in welcoming back to Grand Rapids and Grand Valley, Dr. Andrew Kaufman.
Joe, you are hired as my new publicist. Thank you for that incredibly eloquent and warm introduction. And to the Hauenstein Center, thank you guys. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be speaking under the auspices of the Hauenstein Center for a couple of reasons. One is because the vision, as Gleaves just laid out, is so important and so humane and really quite Tolstoyan. Tolstoy would have been a huge supporter of the Hauenstein Center. And you guys have shown me incredible West Michigan hospitality the past couple of days. And as Joe mentioned, the other reason that it's so powerful and meaningful for me to be here is because my journey with all of this, with Russian literature, began 30 years ago this year when I took my very first Russian language class at a fairly small at that time college called Grand Valley State College. So I really do feel as if tonight, metaphorically and physically, literally, I have come home. I've come full circle. So I will share with you whatever nuggets of wisdom I may have gained in the past 30 years. If you like what you hear, please credit my very first professors at Grand Valley. And if you don't like what you hear, just blame all the professors that I've had since. But do not blame me. One of the most exciting and frustrating aspects of book publishing is when you sit down with your agent and your publisher to decide on a book cover. My agent told me to go into those discussions with very low expectations because they never listen to what an author wants for the cover. They always think that they know best. Well, that is one battle that I was determined to win, and I did win it. I got the cover I want, and the reason that cover on my book was so important to me is because on the cover of Give War and Peace a Chance is a copy, a picture of my very copy of War and Peace. And this is not even my original copy. This is only 7 years old. This is a newer translation. You can imagine, well, I had lost my original copy. Horrible. Had I known I'd be writing a book about War and Peace 20 years later, I wouldn't have lost it. But anyway, here we are with this book. And as you can see, this is a book that has been well loved. It is a book that has been tossed around a bit, both intellectually and physically. It's a book that has been engaged with. I bring this book to class sometimes, and I tell my students, this is what it looks like to read the hell out of a book. This is what it looks like to treat a book not as an object of distant analysis, but to treat it as something with which you can have a relationship. And relationship is not too strong of a word because I have had a relationship with Tolstoy. He and I go back 25 years. I even met Tolstoy before I met War and Peace. And it's been one of the longest relationships of my life. It's been also one of the most intense relationships. As my wife points out frequently when she sees me, she watches me with some concern as I lovingly caress the pages of this tattered copy of War and Peace. My wife is definitely growing jealous. We've had our ups and our downs. I'm talking Tolstoy and I, that is. We've had our disagreements. We went through what I thought was going to be a divorce after graduate school. I refused to read a word of Tolstoy for reasons that we can talk about or not. But as with any good relationship that lasts for a long period of time, as I'm sure many of you know, every couple of years or so I rediscover the reasons that I fell in love with Tolstoy in the first place. And one of those moments came for me back in 2009 when I was invited to teach a class in a prison. An hour-and-a-half class to a group of adult inmates about a short story by Tolstoy called The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which is a famous short story about a middle-aged guy who contracts a fatal illness, and he has to come to terms with how he's lived his life. And so all of these men in this prison had read that story in advance, and I was simply to go there, a fairly young professor at that time, and teach a class about Tolstoy. I had no idea what I was getting into. I'd never been to a prison before in any capacity, thankfully. And I'll never forget that moment when I walked into the room where my classroom was, and I was pretty much dressed like I am today, maybe even a little more formally. And I walked into the room with my suit, and in front of me I see 10 pairs of male eyes staring at me, all wearing, from above, identical orange jumpsuits. And that was my classroom. So the lecture and the everything that I had planned, instinctively in that moment, I knew it wasn't quite right. This is not an academic conversation we're going to have here. So I literally tossed my notes aside. I had enough faith in my knowledge of the story. I sat down in a chair in front of these 15 men, and I simply asked them a question. I said, "What did reading this story mean to you?" And that simple question led to a conversation that was one of the most powerful classroom experiences of my life up to that point. Because through this story, through this character, these men started to share with me their own life stories about decisions that they had made in their lives, about bad decisions they had made, good decisions, about people that they had personally watched die, about their own experiences with death, opportunities that they squandered, opportunities that they never had. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting in this classroom, and I'm realizing that a conversation about Russian literature is really becoming a conversation about real life. And I realized in that moment that that is what I've loved about Tolstoy. That's what I love about literature in general, but particularly Tolstoy. It is the capacity of his art to engage readers from an incredibly wide range of backgrounds in meaningful, authentic conversation about the things that matter to all of us as human beings. What the Russians sometimes call the accursed questions of life. And Gleaves mentioned one of them earlier. Who am I? Why am I here? And how should I live? Gleaves said, how should we live? Both are valid questions. Why are we here? War and Peace is a book that I have read about 15 times. Had I known 20 years ago that I would be writing a book about War and Peace, I would have counted so I could get that number exact. But it's about 15 times. Every couple of years or so, I reread War and Peace. And it's always a new book. It comes alive for me in new ways, depending on what's going on in my life at the time, depending on what's going on in the world. Well, in 2008, War and Peace became a new book for me again, as my family and I were going through a significant financial crisis. Now, I'm not going to share with you all the juicy details. You can find them in the book. But suffice it to say that it was a big enough deal in my life that it felt as if the bottom had dropped out, as if some of my most basic paradigms about who I was and what my place in the world was were shattered. In that moment, I realized literally overnight that my happiness and my security, like the happiness and the security of all of us, are gifts that can be shattered in an instant. I happened to be rereading War and Peace during that period because I was finishing another book about Tolstoy. And I saw something in War and Peace that I hadn't really noticed before. That this is a book about a society going through a time of crisis. It's a book about, it takes place during the early 1800s, during Russia's wars with Napoleon, and eventually describes Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia. And this is a world in which people's lives are being turned upside down by the forces of war and social change and uncertainty and spiritual confusion. And characters are asking, amid all of that, how do I find happiness? How do I find fulfillment in such troubled times? That wasn't an abstract question for me. That was a very personal question, as it was for many of us back in 2008. And it still is a question for many of us. So I came to realize that War and Peace is perhaps the classic for our times. And I realized I needed to write another book about Tolstoy. It wasn't an academic, it wasn't a decision that I made because I needed another publication. I had to write this book. And what I wanted to do is take this massive, intimidating classic of world literature, this book, I can't tell you how many people have told me, and I'm sure many in the room feel this way, who have told me, I can't get through the first 50 pages of this darn thing. All those characters' names, those Russian characters' names, or even people who are so intimidated by the fact that it's 1,500 pages they don't even try. I wrote this book for all of those people, for all of you, whoever in the audience fits that category. Because I wanted to take this intimidating book and just bring it down to a very human, relatable level. I wanted to offer a guide to the setting and the characters and the historical context in a way that would make people's reading of this novel more accessible, more enjoyable. But even more importantly, I wanted to offer a guide to the incredible wisdom that Tolstoy offers on a range of topics in War and Peace. And there are 12 topics that I talk about, and these are actually the 12 titles of my 12 chapters. And I always forget one, so I'll just tell you, I'm just going to read the list. Should probably memorize this at some point. Plans, imagination, rupture, success, idealism, happiness, love, family, courage, death, perseverance, and truth. You know, all the little themes. And I write about these themes and about Tolstoy's wisdom by taking readers on a journey through the characters of the stories of the characters themselves, because that's what Tolstoy does. He wasn't an abstract philosopher. He was a philosopher of life through images, he talks about philosophy by talking about real human experiences. And in the course of talking about the characters' journeys, I also interweave stories from Tolstoy's life, because every one of these themes was vitally personal to him. And I also interweave stories from my own 25-year journey with Tolstoy. And this is not a plug for the book, but just to give you a sense, one of the things that was important to me is that I wanted the structure of my book to mirror the plot of War and Peace. So as you're moving through my book, it's as if you're moving through the novel itself. So once I described it as a kind of Cliff Notes on steroids, and my publicist didn't like that, so I've stopped describing it that way. Apparently I haven't stopped because I just described it that way again. And the point is that even if you don't have plans in the very near future to read the novel itself, everything you need to know for the cocktail party is in my book. It's no coincidence that the first chapter, one of the very first chapters I wrote, was called Rupture. And I used the word rupture intentionally. I was going back and forth between rupture and crisis, and I wanted to use the word rupture because it gets at a little bit more what I was after. It is the sense of when the fabric of our lives has literally been torn, when things fall apart, when our most fundamental paradigms within which we operated no longer work, which is something like what happened to me back in 2008. Well, Tolstoy believed that these moments of rupture, which every person in this room, I'm sure, has experienced at some point in your life, these are incredible opportunities. They're opportunities to tap into forms of insight, of understanding, of creativity, of strength, that often elude us when everything is fine, that often elude us during ordinary, smooth, flowing times. Well, one of the characters who experiences this in the novel early on is a young man by the name of Nikolai Rostov, who's one of the male heroes of the book. He's 18 years old at the time, and he spends a night playing poker, and he loses, in the course of about 14 hours, 43,000 rubles, which in today's money was a couple $100,000. Now, he was not a poor kid. He came from an aristocratic family. But even for his family, which was having financial difficulties at that time, that's a hell of a lot of money. And so he is so ashamed at what he's done that he comes home and really all he wants to do is put a bullet through his own head. And he thinks that. That's all that's left for me. But instead of putting a bullet through his head, he does something else. He listens to his sister, Natasha, sing. And he's so moved, so transported by the beauty of her voice that he actually joins in and starts singing with her, and he doesn't want the moment to end. How many times has Nikolai listened to his sister Natasha sing? Probably hundreds of times before. She's constantly singing. But on that day, on that occasion, on the heels of his own personal crisis, he's actually able to hear her as if for the very first time. I was able to hear the beauty of that scene for the first time on the heels of my own personal crisis, and I just want to read to you briefly from the book where I describe the day, a few days after I got the news, the bad financial news. Then, one dreary afternoon, I was sitting in my rented Charlottesville, Virginia home and closed the curtains, wallowing in self-pity when a funny thing happened. I started filing through a collection of old CDs and put on some random clarinet concertos by Carl Maria von Weber. It had been about 20 years since I'd last heard those pieces, around the time I quit playing the clarinet myself. Slouched there on the couch with my laptop, clicking back and forth between Outlook Express and the Palm Pilot desktop, I listened. I still don't know why, but as that clarinet sang over the orchestra, now with sad, sweet cadences, now with forceful, angry passion, something was kindled inside me. Memories of childhood assailed me, including images of my clarinet playing, but it went beyond mere memory. I stood up, closed my eyes, and let those sounds wash over me, my body swaying to a beauty and mystery well beyond myself. There I was, in the middle of my messy living room, in my unexceptional Charlottesville house, with the throw pillows strewn about and my poor incontinent cat's shit stains amending the carpeting, And for a moment, I was terribly happy. What are Ponzi schemes and stock markets and washout shysters in such a moment? Everything seemed irrelevant in comparison to that opening into eternity I glimpsed. How many times I'd read and enjoyed that scene in which Nikolai listens to Natasha sing, but only now, in the aftermath of my own personal crisis, did I realize, for perhaps the first time, what that scene is about. Tolstoy is describing what you feel when your world has crashed. The ground beneath you has cracked open, and all you want to do is go to sleep. But then, out of nowhere, you hear or see something so beautiful, so strikingly real, that you suddenly awaken into a new consciousness, hoping the day never ends. Pardon me while the professor takes a sip of tea. Another topic that I write about in my book that haunted Tolstoy is the topic of success. Success. Tolstoy was an incredibly ambitious young man. He desperately wanted success. In fact, he wrote in his diary when he was in his 20s that, "I'm so ambitious that I'm afraid that if I had to choose between fame and virtue, I would choose fame." So he desperately wanted success. He was terrified of achieving it for all the wrong reasons. And then, when he does achieve it by anybody's objective standards, the 52-year-old author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, two of the world's great novels, felt like he was a failure. He hadn't done enough. He was wasting his time. So he dresses up in his peasant garb, his wooden sandals, he takes his walking staff, a few servants, and he walks a couple hundred kilometers by foot over a 4-day period to go to a monastery to ask a famous monk what he, Leo Tolstoy, should do with his life. And apparently the meeting didn't go very well because the very next day he actually returned home by train, first class. So it's a quirky story, but I think we can all relate to the anxiety that motivated Tolstoy to take this trip. What is success then? How do we know when we have achieved it? How much is enough? How do we know when we have arrived? Well, one of the characters in War and Peace who grapples with this question in a profound way is a young man by the name of Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, who's another one of the great heroes of War and Peace. And he's 27 when the novel opens. And this is a young man that would seem to have everything. He has brains, he's got good breeding, comes from a good family, he's got great connections, he's on his way to a successful career, he's even got a beautiful pregnant wife, and none of it is good enough for him. He wants more, he wants glory. And so he leaves his wife and his family, and he goes off to the front to join the Russian war effort against Napoleon. And on the evening before the Battle of Austerlitz, he muses, he dreams that he is going to single-handedly lead the Russians into victory over the French the next day during battle, and that he's going to win the St. George Cross and become beloved and respected by everybody, and that moment of glory, that moment of transcendence is so important to him that he's willing to give up everything for it. He's willing to sacrifice his own family for that one moment of glory. Well, here's where Tolstoy is a genius. What happens the next day during battle is as Prince Andrei is running out onto the battlefield, the first thing that happens is he gets whacked over the head by an enemy soldier's musket. He falls onto the ground. He's lying prostrate on the ground. He looks up at the sky and he sees the lofty, infinite sky with the clouds creeping across it. And he thinks to himself, how is it I've never noticed that sky before? Good question. How is it any of us fails to see the bigger picture as we so often do? confusing the contentment we seek with the narrower visions of conquest we pursue. Like Andrei, we frequently misunderstand the true nature of reality. Life, Tolstoy says, isn't a fast elevator shooting us up to the top floor, but a continuous river of individual moments flowing endlessly into one another. The Battle of Austerlitz, which would go down in history as a terrible loss for Russia, is one of the great moments of Prince Andrei's life, but not for the reasons he might have thought. The majesty of battle would seem to be his for the taking, or at least the taking in, when wham, life, in the form of a soldier's musket, hits him over the head and knocks him into a new consciousness. Through the haze of his blurred vision, he sees clearly for the first time the immensity of the universe indifferent to his worldly plans and ambitions. And for a brief moment, he gets it. And I skip a few paragraphs. If you ask any ordinary Russian today what exactly happened at the Battle of Austerlitz, most would be hard-pressed to remember much of anything about that military campaign except for one little thing. That stirring moment in War and Peace when Tolstoy's hero has that powerful epiphany while gazing wounded up at the glorious sky. Such is the power of Tolstoy's art, not to mention the accuracy of his insight. Our greatest and most enduring personal triumphs, Tolstoy observes, are seldom the ones described in the headlines or the history books. They don't appear on the scoreboards or in our public celebrations. More often than not, they are those transformative moments we experience in the quiet inwardness of our souls when the cameras are turned off and nobody is watching. Except for God, that is, and Tolstoy. Now, my editor wanted me to get rid of the word God in that sentence. She thought it would be too jarring. One of the reasons that I wanted to add the word God is because there were a couple of reasons. One, I won't go into the details, but the point I want to make here is that Tolstoy was anything but God. He was about as far from God as human beings can get, even though sometimes he thought he was God. He was a deeply flawed man. Deeply flawed man. He had a gambling addiction, for starters. When he was 26 years old, he lost the house in which he was born because of a gambling spree. He went on a gambling spree, just like Nikolai Rostov. And he lost 6,000 rubles at the gambling table, at the poker table one night. And he sent a letter home and he said, what do we have that's worth 6,000 rubles that I can pay off this gambling debt with? And the only thing that he had was literally the house in which he was born. And they had to sell the house. And the horse-drawn carriages came and literally plank by plank, brick by brick, all 42 stories were dismantled, loaded onto horse-drawn carriages and hauled away to a neighboring village about 20 miles away, where it stood, by the way, empty until 1913. And it was torn down, and the brick was used as rubble, and the wood was used as firewood. So on the day that that happened, Tolstoy's reaction was very much like the reaction of Nikolai Rostov when he had his gambling loss. He wrote in his diary, "I'm so disgusted with myself that I'd like to forget about my own existence." Well, if you open his diary 2 weeks later, you read these words: "Played cards again, lost another 200 rubles. Can't promise to stop." Tolstoy had a voracious sexual appetite. He not only fathered 13 legitimate children, he fathered one illegitimate child before marriage. We don't know. We don't think he was adulterous, but he certainly had an illegitimate child to a local peasant woman before he was married. And this is incredibly ironic for someone who later on in life preached celibacy, both in and out of marriage, which was a hypocrisy his wife never let him live down. It's kind of very hypocritical for someone who had 13 children and one illegitimate child. Tolstoy could be unbelievably impractical. He could make really unwise decisions. He gave away the copyrights to all of his works that he wrote after 1881. He secretly published a letter. His wife didn't know about it. in the Russian newspapers in 1891, announcing that I, Leo Tolstoy, hereby grant the rights to anything that I have written after 1881. Anyone can print it in Europe or Russia free of royalties. And the reason he did that is because he thought it was wrong for him and his family to profit from his own labors. That was the time when he was very anti-capitalist. And his wife was not very happy with that decision. She was infuriated. In fact, that was one of a few occasions where she attempted suicide. And how can you do this, she said. This is completely irresponsible. You are a father. You have children who need to be clothed and educated. Yes, you have your morals, but you also have the real-world practical responsibilities. And to this day, that decision is still discussed in the Tolstoy family. I was at Yasnaya Polyana a couple of years ago giving a talk. And after the talk, during Q&A, I just threw out a question. Just for the heck of it, I was maybe practicing my Russian, I don't know. And I just wanted to be a little bit, have some fun, and say, well, what did you guys in the audience, what did you think about the decision that he made to give away the copyrights to his works? And in the audience happened to be Tolstoy's great-great-grandson and great-great-great-grandson, who are affiliated with the Tolstoy Museum and Estate at Yasnaya Polyana. And the great-great-grandson said he made the right decision because he didn't want his works of art to be turned into a commercial commodity. He wanted them to be larger than that. And his nephew, who is Tolstoy's great-great-great-grandson, who happened to be 20 years old at the time and just finishing the university and trying to find a job, said making money is not immoral. So there's the great debate, socialism and capitalism, that Tolstoy triggered, and to this day it is still being discussed. That was a fascinating moment for me to watch that. I've given enough examples, but let me just throw out one more. Tolstoy ran away from home at the age of 82. It's funny, it's tragic. He left his wife of 48 years a note, thanking her for 48 years of honorable marriage, but telling her that their differences are simply irreconcilable and that he wants to go off and die alone, and please don't come after me. All of this is beautifully described in the novel called The Last Station by Jay Perini, which is also made into a movie. So you've heard all this, and you may be wondering, why then should we listen to someone like this? Why should we listen to the wisdom of somebody like this who made all of these mistakes? And my very simple answer is precisely because he made all of these mistakes and was able to distill these mistakes and real people through art. He brought all of this to his characters, all of his own quirks and his contradictions. To Nikolai Rostov, he gave his gambling addiction. To Prince Andrei Balkonsky, he gave his overweening pride and ambition. To Natasha Rostova, he gave his narcissism. So this is a guy who was full of weaknesses, but he brought all of that to his characters, and that's what makes these characters so real and so relatable. And in fact, I would argue that the wisdom that Tolstoy offers in War and Peace is even more useful than the wisdom that he offered in his later, more moralistic works in which he was intentionally trying to teach. And the reason is because these are not caricatures, these are not ideals, these are real people that he created. And he had a capacity to create real people more accurately, more complexly than any other writer that I'm familiar with. And these are people that you and I can relate to. And what's more, and what is most powerful about all of this, is that this writer, who saw all of the flaws in himself, who saw all of the flaws in his characters, who knew about political corruption, who knew about social injustice, who described all of that in his works, who describes battlefields drenched in blood. He knew about all of this, but this is a guy who still never lost his faith in human promise. He never became ultimately a cynic, which is so fashionable, particularly in our own times, but was also fashionable in the late 1800s. Man is flowing, Tolstoy once said. In him there are all possibilities. He was evil, now he is good. He was stupid, now he is smart. And the other way around. In this is the greatness of man. And it is that, he wrote those words, it is that optimism rooted in reality that's one of the defining features of Tolstoy, a feature that has always inspired me. And I say optimism rooted in reality because Tolstoy's optimism was not naive or Pollyanna. It was earned in the crucible of living. It was earned through error, through mistakes, through wrong paths taken. And it's that optimism rooted in reality that has not only inspired me, but has inspired generations of readers. Ordinary readers and extraordinary readers, people like Mahatma Gandhi, who was given a copy of Tolstoy's late essay, The Kingdom of God is Within You, when Gandhi was 25 and living in South Africa and going through a very difficult time, as I'm sure many of you know. And The Kingdom of God is Within You is one of the great exposés of the evils and the injustices of various forms of modern government. But it is also an inspiring vision of the possibility of social change, but of a social change that can come about by recognizing what Tolstoy called the divine spark, or what Gandhi would call the soul force that exists within every human being. That message, that vision was so important to Gandhi that he would later say that it was one of a small handful of the most transformational books of his own life. Nelson Mandela was given a copy of War and Peace to read when he was incarcerated at Robben Island. And he would later say in Long Walk to Freedom that it remained his favorite work of fiction, and that it was a book that consoled him and inspired him in one of his darkest hours, and that it was a book that taught him some crucial lessons about life and about leadership. There was one character in particular that Mandela was intrigued by. It was Tolstoy's portrait of the Russian commander-in-chief, General Kutuzov, who led the Russian forces in 1812 during the French invasion. This is a man, Kutuzov, who is compassionate towards his enemies, and he's cunning. He's beloved by his own troops, but he's also respected by them. But above all, he had an incredible capacity to listen to his own people, to listen to the enemy, to listen to the forces of nature, which ultimately becomes the real ally in the fight against Napoleon, because Napoleon, 9/10 of Napoleon's army, is literally wiped out by the Russian winter. And Kutuzov was intuitive enough to sense all of this, to not insist on this ideology or that ideology, to let the strategists and the counselors and the administrators argue and scream at one another about what they thought the right decision to do. Everyone was telling him, attack, 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 the French are wounded. And Kutuzov said, no, we don't need to attack. You don't need to attack a wounded animal. He's going to die on his own. Why shed more blood? And it's that kind of leadership that Mandela said inspired him directly when he went back to become the president of South Africa. He was inspired by this leader who himself led his country through one of its darkest periods. The hero of my tale, Tolstoy once said, is truth. The hero of my tale is truth with a capital T. It was an incredibly bold thing for him to write. He wrote it in the 1850s because this was an era when everyone thought that they had a monopoly on the truth. This was a time when the great reforms of Alexander were being debated and ultimately implemented. It was a time when the conservatives and the liberals were at each other's throats about the future of Russia. The conservatives were saying the path to our future lay in the ideals of the Russian past. The liberals were saying, no, our future lay in the ideals of the European progress and enlightenment. And they were screaming back and forth at one another in the journals and the newspapers of the time, and even physically in meetings. And here Tolstoy comes along and says, well, the hero of my tale is truth. So what is this truth that he had in mind? The truth is not the liberals' truth. The truth wasn't the conservatives' truth. It's not the Hindus or the Jews or the Christians. It's not his truth or my truth. The truth he had in mind is the truth, encompassing all of us as human beings, the truth about our shared human experience, our shared quest as individuals, as communities, for purpose, for meaning. There are nearly 600 characters in War and Peace. Each one of them is distinct. Each one of them is on his or her own path, and yet what unites all of them is they're all on this journey together. Every one of them knows what it means to love and to lose. They know what it means to contend with uncertainty, to grapple with death, and above all, they know what it means to suffer. And suffering becomes one of the great universals in War and Peace, the universal human experience that brings everyone together. In fact, this idea is built into the very title of the novel itself. The word for peace in Russian, in War and Peace, is mir, and mir has another meaning in Russian. It also means world, cosmos. So when a Russian is hearing War and Peace, they're also subconsciously hearing war and the world. Kind of interesting, no? Changes the way you think about the book a little bit. What I think Tolstoy was getting at and playing with brilliantly with that title is that ultimately all times are troubled times in some way. Life is about struggle. It is about hardship. It is about change and uncertainty. And if we as individuals or as communities are going to find our purpose, going to find our contentment, going to find our peace, if you will, we're not going to find it out there in some utopian ideal. We're not going to find it in some social or political ideology, which by their very nature are disconnected from the messiness of life and the messiness of human nature. We're only going to find our peace right here, right down here in the rough and tumble of our own messy, imperfect world and within our own imperfect selves. And nobody learns this lesson in War and Peace more than my favorite character I write about a lot in my book, Pierre Bezukhov, one of the great heroes of War and Peace. When the novel starts out, he has just inherited the largest fortune in Russia. He gets into a disastrous marriage with a fortune-hunting woman, Helen Kuragin. The marriage falls apart. Pierre becomes a Freemason. He thinks he's going to nurse his wounds by becoming a social activist. So he's going to free all the peasants on his estate. That's a disaster because he doesn't have very much practical ability, and the peasants don't want to be free. And so he tries on one different ideology, one different social program after another in trying to find himself. He's still a young man. When the French come into town in 1812, he decides he wants to check out battles. So here's Pierre going to the Battle of Borodino, which is one of the great bloody battles of 1812. And we see Pierre in his white summer hat and his green tailcoat bouncing around the battlefield of Borodino with bullets flying all around him. And people are, how does this guy not get killed? But he's a good guy, and the soldiers kind of like him because he's fundamentally a kind-hearted, big-hearted guy, still a little naive. And then he goes back to Moscow, which is now having been set on fire, and he sees an Armenian woman being harassed by a French soldier, and Pierre knows that that's wrong. He intervenes. He gets into a fist fight with the French soldier who ends up arresting him for arson, and Pierre now becomes a prisoner of war. 7 years earlier, Pierre had just inherited the largest fortune in Russia. Now, he's a prisoner of war. And one day, he's told that he's going to be executed. So he's marched with the other prisoners to the firing squad. And he learns that that was just a joke. He's just there to witness the execution. That's a common joke in Russian history. The Tsar did that to Dostoevsky too. Made him think he was going to be executed and then changed his mind and said, no, we're just going to send you to Siberia for 4 years instead. So this is what happens to Pierre, and in that moment, he realizes he's saved, but that moment in which he watches a young factory worker being executed, his body slumping against the wood plank, the blood coming through the blindfold, and Pierre realizes that could have been him just a few minutes earlier. That moment shatters everything for Pierre. It is the ultimate rupture. He completely loses his faith in God, in the purpose of life, in the meaning of life. Nothing makes sense. The springs that held up his life, Tolstoy said, had just fallen down. And in that moment, he's thrown into a dark shed where he meets a man. The man sitting next to Pierre is Platon Karatayev, an old peasant who has ended up in French captivity while serving a mandatory 25-year service in the Russian Imperial Army as punishment for having once trespassed on a neighbor's property. No stranger to suffering himself, Platon knows what Pierre is going through, and so he consoles the young fellow not only with his soothing words, but by doing something seemingly quite unremarkable. He gives Pierre some potatoes. Now, these are not the first potatoes Pierre has ever eaten. If you've ever glanced at a menu in a Russian restaurant, you know that Russians have as many ways of preparing this ubiquitous national vegetable as Eskimos have of naming snow. But these might be the first potatoes Pierre has ever really tasted. More than physical nourishment, these modest little hunks of carbohydrate handed to him in an act of simple kindness are spiritual sustenance as well. Reconnecting him to the human family, to the earth, to himself, they bring Pierre back to life. His spiritual rebirth then begins not under the intoxicating influence of any of those grand plans, or indeed from the realm of heroic fantasy, but in the fulfillment of his most basic bodily needs. Seldom have the ordinary rhythms of everyday life or the details of his immediate surroundings so enraptured Pierre. Rarely has he immersed himself so fully and yet so unpretentiously in the greatest pleasure of all, the joy of simply being alive. There in that dark shed on the darkest day of his life, Pierre touches something solid and transcendent in his now pulverized world. He glimpses that elusive it, the real thing. We've all had that moment when our ordinary, perhaps even crummy life suddenly strikes us as something pretty extraordinary after all. Just when you're ready to throw in the towel over a job, a relationship, an addiction, an illness, over life itself, grace may magically intervene, illuminating a fresh possibility you hadn't imagined, offering an entirely new way of seeing an all too familiar problem. Now it makes sense, you're tempted to shout. You don't, of course, for you've discovered a secret gift that need not be advertised to the world. And that private little heaven is what we have earned by marching through hell. Had Pierre merely been told that he might have achieved that illumination by following the prepackaged advice offered by the Freemason Bazdiev all those chapters back, his discovery surely would have seemed less striking, dull, and cheap even. His realization in captivity is so compelling to him, and thus to the reader, in direct proportion to how long he has had to fight in order to achieve it. For 7 years, we've followed this young man through the ups and downs of his tumultuous journey as he careers from one grand failure to another. To find any nuggets of wisdom, he has first had to dig deep in the dirt, sift well through the dross. He has had to go through the war, in short, before he could find his peace. When Tolstoy was working on War and Peace, a novelist sent him a copy of his recent novel asking for Tolstoy's advice. And Tolstoy didn't like it. And he was not afraid to tell people that he didn't like things. And the reason he didn't like it is because the novelist was trying too hard to be topical. At that time in Russia, with all of these debates, all of the social and political ideologies being debated, all you had to really do to be at least a commercially successful novel is choose something that was that's topical and write a good story around it, and voila, you've created a novel. But Tolstoy didn't think that's the purpose of art at all. And so in his letter to this man, to this novelist, he wrote these words, and I will end with these words from Tolstoy. The goal of an artist is not to solve a question irrefutably, but to force people to love life in all of its countless, inexhaustible manifestations. If I were told that I could write a work of art in which I would definitively resolve all of the social questions of today, I wouldn't spend 2 hours on such a work. But if I knew that what I wrote today would be read by the children of today in 20 years and that they would laugh and weep and fall in love with life because of it, then I would dedicate all of my energy and all of my time to such a work. Thank you. So I'm not sure what the timing situation is, but I'm here all night for questions.
So we do have a few minutes for Q&A, and what we'll do is I'll be here and Chad will be over there, and if you have any questions, please just feel free to come up here and use the microphone.
All right. Yeah, so thank you very much. I mean, it was very interesting. I really appreciate it. And I think I'm sold on your main argument, give Tolstoy a chance. I agree, absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm
You still need to buy the book, though.
They're out there, right? That'll be my next stop. I'm just curious, though. So, I mean, you describe a lot of the ways in which, Tolstoy really articulates situations we confront in life, especially these crisis situations and things they can teach us, or calls our attention to things we might notice and learn at those times. I'm curious, though, in terms of this sort of broader question, how should we live? Do you think Tolstoy has, portrayed in his novels, a kind of general answer to that question? That's my main question to you. And the reason I bring that up primarily is you mentioned the Count Bezukov from War and Peace, and I think of maybe Levin from Anna Karenina. I mean, these seem to me to be central characters whose life trajectories and realizations toward the end of the books maybe carry more weight, have more significance. You might think, if there's an answer to this question in Tolstoy, it's those characters. And I'd really like to hear what you think about that. Is there kind of a vision, not just these sort of fragmentary pieces, but a broader vision of how we should live in Tolstoy?
No, it's a fascinating question. And I mean, Tolstoy went through many different periods in his own life in which he came to very different conclusions to that question. So I think in War and Peace, I think one of his answers is the answer that we see in Pierre, which a lot of people are not going to agree with. Live right now. Not kumbaya right now, but be present with who you're with what you're doing. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but Pierre was forced to do it. It wasn't a choice. Everything had been stripped of him. And finally, Tolstoy even describes, he achieved a kind of freedom that he never had. So I think that's one answer. A lot of people aren't going to agree with that. Later on in life, Tolstoy had different answers. Live in accordance with the law of love that was articulated, particularly by Jesus in the Gospels. A lot of people don't agree with that, and a lot of the works that he wrote illustrating that don't have the richness of War and Peace either. But I think what's most powerful about Tolstoy is he invites us not to answer the question, but to do something that many of us don't do in a serious way, which is to ask the question, to engage with the question. It's not so much the answers as it is engaging with that quest and realizing that we're on this earth for more than just material reasons, that there's something bigger out there and we're connected to something larger, and opening ourselves to that and to the implications of that, which is to ask the question that Gleaves mentioned at the beginning, why are we here? And so I think Tolstoy the artist depicted that journey more powerfully and more compellingly than Tolstoy the moralist offered specific answers. It's not so much the answers that he gives us as it is an attitude towards life. And it starts with looking around, being open to the beauty, to the joy, to the pain, to the suffering, to everything. There is one line in War and Peace, though. If I had to boil down the message of War and Peace to one line, I could have never written a book because it's too short. And I'm not going to interpret this, I'm just going to tell you what it is, and you can interpret it yourselves. There is no greatness where there is no simplicity, goodness, and truth. There is no greatness where there is no simplicity, goodness, and truth.
Hello? Okay. My question is, I'm going to kind of give a general observation. Grand Rapids is a city of art. We've got the Art Prize. We've got Laugh Fest that I would consider a form of art. What I don't really see is literature being discussed and viewed as an art form in Grand Rapids in our city through the general public. And I'm wondering, I know you have a list of topics that are kind of universal, but if there's a single topic that is more universal or more effective to talking to a general public that people can relate to.
So this young man was in a workshop that I did this morning at Grand Valley. What's your name, by the way?
Matthew.
Matthew. And the first thing I would say is that you are the guy to start that. Based on everything that I think you need to ask people questions, and I think you need to listen. I don't think there's one single topic, and through many, many years of teaching and speaking, I keep rediscovering over and over again that people just resonate with different topics, and there's no rhyme or reason why, and at different points in their life. Some people read my book because they're the death chapter. Other people are interested in the family questions, love. And so I think that's a very personal question, and I think from a practical standpoint, if you do want to start a group of that kind, and I think you might be the guy to do it, you get people together and you start talking to them and you ask them, what are the things that you're interested in? What are the topics that you're interested in? And how could we put together a reading list? And that I could potentially help you with. How could we put together a reading list that will help us address that? But it's a great question. I'm serious. I mean, you've been engaged and passionate about this. I really want to encourage you to send me an email and we'll talk more.
Andy, thank you so much for all the wisdom you shared out of Tolstoy's writing and art and your life. Last night we got into a very interesting conversation about people who continue to read Tolstoy to understand Russia today and its leader. Would you please reflect on that a little bit?
I wrote an article a couple of months ago called How Tolstoy Can Save Putin's Soul. War and Peace tells a story that is all too familiar in Russian history. It's a story of a country being invaded by a foreign power. The Mongols invaded Russia in the 12th and 13th century. Maybe I got the centuries wrong, but the famous Napoleon invasion of Russia in 1812. Hitler invaded Soviet Union in 1941. And so this is a story that is the story of a country under siege is very deeply rooted in Russian consciousness to this day. And Putin knows that, which is one of the reasons it plays so well to the Russian public when he blames the current crisis on Russia on foreign interference. This is another example, he said, of our country being under siege by Western powers who want to eradicate us. And in fact, he's explicitly said that. And if we want to be a great nation, we need to resist that. And we need to come together in an act of solidarity and fight these evil forces, these evil foreign forces that want to destroy us. That plays to a Russian audience. And War and Peace, by the way, helped to solidify that image of a country under siege. Tolstoy memorialized this tragic event in Russian history, and it's no accident that Stalin had hundreds of thousands of copies of War and Peace printed during World War II to give to the Russian troops, the Soviet troops during. But Tolstoy's point in War and Peace is not that. The lesson that his country, that as individuals, as a society, was to learn from this tragic event is not to beat our chest, not to become Prince Andrei Bolkonsky before the Battle of Austerlitz, not to become another Napoleon, but to bear our sufferings with grace, with dignity, with humility, and to be good people. There is no greatness where there is no simplicity, goodness, and truth. And so for Tolstoy, the mark of Russian greatness is not its capacity to divide and conquer or to return force with force. And you may not agree with Tolstoy's message, but I'm just explaining it. I'm just articulating. That's not his message. We don't want to, that's not his message. His message is to be more like Kutuzov, to be strong, to be cunning, but also to be compassionate and to be kind. And so Putin, I think, has misinterpreted War and Peace, or has misinterpreted the message of War and Peace. And in fact, of all the characters in War and Peace that Putin most resembles, he doesn't resemble any of the Russian characters. He actually resembles the French invader Napoleon himself. But this question of what makes us a great country is so deeply rooted in Russian consciousness. Constantly been asking this question, and it's a question that's explored in the art, in the literature for centuries. And that's why I believe that literature is such a powerful vehicle for understanding contemporary dynamics, because so much of what's going on in Russia today is not just political or social, it's deeply cultural. It's psychological. What's being played out is not just a geopolitical drama, which most people focus on, but it's what I would call a drama of the Russian soul, grappling with this question, what really makes a nation, and specifically our nation, great? Oh, I wasn't looking at you. You asked the question. Thank you.
Thank you, splendid. Hints of the same sort of situation in some of the other great nations of the world, all the way back to ancient times and even to our time, I think. What's your brief overview? Other great nations, the Greeks,
I don't have one.
the Italians, the French, perhaps even America. Certainly the British, to a touch.
I mean, I think the more important question is for every nation to ask themselves and to really soul search is to ask that question, how do we define our greatness? We're so often seduced by the external manifestations of greatness, which are, in our political discourse, in our patriotic images, and those are important. And Tolstoy would agree that those are important as well. But I think equally important is that individuals and communities and nations really have an authentic conversation about that is, how do we perceive our own greatness? And are we defining and are we living in accordance with what we think makes a great nation? Or are we not living up to our own highest ideals? And I think that's as true of America as it is of Russia. In the same way that the question that I talked about earlier, what is success? Many of us don't think about that. We just assume we know what success is because, there's so many forces and influences in our society which tell us that this is what success is and this is what success is not. But there's always a handful of people who stand back and say, wait a minute, I'm not sure I agree with that definition or the broadly accepted definition of success. I want to have a real conversation about that. So what I'm encouraging, let's have a real conversation about something like greatness as well. And happiness, and love, and courage, and death, and truth. If there's one thing that Tolstoy shows us, it's that these words are, the concept described by every one of these words is infinitely richer than the word could possibly depict. So we need to play with language and realize that a word like greatness is just a label that we put onto a concept which is much richer than a word greatness. And we need to explore what the concept is, what it really means.
So, enjoyed your talk. Thank you for coming to Grand Rapids. A few years ago, I read an article about Constance Garnett, who apparently translated Tolstoy and the other great 19th century Russian writers into English, and her translations were definitive for 100 years. But it turns out that she made all the great Russian writers sound exactly the same with the same voice when in fact they had very different voices. And also, apparently whenever she encountered a difficult passage, she would just omit it. So she would just leave it out. So, but apparently there are new editions, where there's a couple new editions of the great writers. Could you talk about the various translations?
Sure. I mean, it's always a question. Let me start by, what translation to use. And let me start by saying something that's going to sound, is going to be heretical to certain purists. But Tolstoy is one of those writers that loses less in translation than other writers. And that's simply because he was much more interested in getting. He wasn't as self-conscious about language. He wasn't a 20th century modern writer who was very conscious and self-conscious about playing with language and was interested in language play for its own sake. He wanted to get at the essence. He wanted to get at the universal human experience. So that's why his writing is often very direct and very simple. It can also be incredibly verbose and long-winded. But having said that, there are some translations that are better than others. And my recommendation is the Paveer Volokhovsky translation of War and Peace, because I think they do a nice job of capturing two things that are true about War and Peace, both the elegance and the awkwardness. War and Peace is, the problem with Constance Garnett and other translators is they turned Tolstoy into a Victorian British writer. And Tolstoy was much more Russian, if that makes sense. What is Russian? And he was awkward. He would repeat phrases. He would repeat words in a single sentence. Because he would write whatever he needed to write to create, to get readers to getting at the essence of what it is that he wanted to show, even if it broke the rules of good novel writing, including 2.5% of War and Peace being in French, including the opening paragraph of War and Peace. Russia's great epic, national epic, opens in French. And he did that because that's the language of the aristocracy. And he also did it because he was being Tolstoy.
One more question.
Enjoyed your writing very much. Also enjoyed reading War and Peace. And I'd like you to comment on what made you laugh when you read War and Peace, because it's. I think there's many funny moments.
Yeah.
Is there one in particular that you think back with enjoyment?
There's a lot of humor in War and Peace. One moment that comes to mind is when but the humor is always mixed in with tragedy. Not always. Sometimes it's not. And the humor is often just the quirkiness of human nature. There's a moment where Princess Maria, who's the daughter of who's Prince Andrei's sister, and the daughter of the old Count Bolkonsky, and she's a spinster, and he wants to marry her off, but he doesn't want to marry her off because she takes care of him, and it's a really abusive relationship. And there's one moment when she finally gets a suitor, and he doesn't like this guy or his father, the suitor, Anatol Kuragin. He thinks that he's a player, and he's right. And he says to her something like, well, you can go, as a father, I want to give you freedom to make your own choice. I'm going to give you your freedom. So you make your own choice. But he doesn't like you anyway. I mean, if you end up marrying, he's just going to take Madame Bourrienne as a lover, and he'll get your dowry. But go ahead and make your choice. And it's so mean, but it's so real, and he knows that it's mean. And Tolstoy captures that, and he feels terrible about it. But that's just the quirkiness of human nature, and I did a pretty disastrous job of recreating it. But you get the idea. And also, all his descriptions of Napoleon they're not just spot on. I mean, he is incredibly ironic in the way he describes. Everyone thinks Napoleon, was this great leader, but actually, and Tolstoy describes him like this little kid, like playing in a sandbox that has no clue who the kings are slaves of history, and so he treats Napoleon like a little kid, which was just funny.
Let's give Professor Andrew Kaufman a hand. Well, because this is a homecoming for the professor, he's coming back to West Michigan, I think we ought to give him a gift. And the gift we chose in honor of Ralph is a Ralph Hauenstein swag bag. So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. The professor will be signing books in the next room, so please avail yourselves. Thank you again.
Thank you all very much.